Recording in progress. Welcome, universally logical spirits, to Sessions of Spirit number 23. I'm going to do a really quick recap, as I always do, for the new people who are just coming into the circle of reason. You'll learn what that is as you go through the series. You can go back, all the notes are free, but I'm going to try and sum up the last 22 sessions in 2 minutes for you. And I'm going to just put my timer on so we can make sure it's quick. It's potent, but as you read back, you will be able to understand what we're doing here. So, session 1 was about Hegel being the greatest philosopher because he summed up 3,000 years of wisdom. Session 2 is that nobody understood how he did that. Number 3 is that once you do understand it, you can change the world. Number 4 is that you get beyond the stereotypes of Hegel and you grasp what's called the first negation. Number 5 is about starting his system properly by breaking out of that first negation into the circle of reason. Number 6 is that when you get to the end of the circle, it looks like religion, but philosophy, or genuine philosophy, is the sublation of religion. 7 is that you sublate it with universal logic, which we're going to put into analytical modern notation to win the Nobel Peace Prize practically. Number 8 is that you begin this universal logic with polemics, or that first negation. But 9, the truth of that polemic is the polemic of polemics as sublation, which is genuine refutation. Number 10 is that there's a master class in this sublation called The Science of Logic that Hegel wrote. Number 11 is that the science of logic is way more profound than people think. It's literally the ineffable speaking itself. Number 12 is that this is the purpose of life, to grasp this living logic. Number 13 is that we're going to do it for everybody. That's the true and deeper purpose of life, because everybody's infinitely valuable. Because number 14, it's an experience of being connected to God or the absolute. But number 15, you don't have to think about it religiously. You can think about it atheistically as a connection to yourself in a scientific way. Number 16 is that this is just what our gurus have been doing the whole time, bringing our inner children out as the science of logic implicit. 17 is that we have to sublate old mysticism into the new power of now. 18 is that this is the limit of our fun, the games, our flow. And 19 is that reason is also sort of funny. When you have the ultimate polemical moment, it's funny. That's why people love philosophers, because number 20 is that the ideal philosopher sublates rather than negates in this universal logic of peace. 21 is that this is how you overcome evil as one-sidedness in your logic. And that number 22, the last session, was about how we sort of have to do this practically, or else our disruptive technologies or particular knowledge won't be in this universal mode, and we're going to get this one-sidedness in a really volatile way, such as the technology CRISPR. So we have to return to this to the logic, and we have to grasp it even more concretely. So I don't know if somebody can post the notes in the chat, but if you're watching this sometime in the future, the notes should be with the video wherever you find this, and they should always be free. So if there's anybody trying to charge money for this, they shouldn't. This is being given away for free as an attempt to create a new world spirit that breaks out of this sort of one-sidedness that is keeping our culture in abstraction rather than universality. So let us get into the paragraph that summarizes this session, which is called the one-paragraph summary. You can say a lot with little. So this session is called 23 SOS. SOS also stands for Save Our Souls, to emphasize the practical part of genuine philosophy that Hegel talks about. But it also stands for Sessions of Spirit. This one is titled Universal Logic of Leibniz, Frege, Chomsky, and Hegel. The paragraph goes like this. The idea idealizing ideally. Great philosophical minds throughout history have all sensed that there must be one logic which unites and brings together a theory of everything, an infinitely interconnected and integrated being that makes sense. Not only material sense, but rational sense. Leibniz tried in his Characteristica Universalis. Frege desired this universal logic and tried as well, but failed to take his notation to the universal level. In modern times, Noam Chomsky has also tried with his theory on universal grammar. But only Hegel claimed to grasp not only the universality of such a logic in its purity in the abstract medium of supersensuous thought, but grasped it in the first version of its completion, This is the highest level of which a philosopher can draw from a place of wisdom. Once again, quite potent. Is it purple prose, or is this actual substantial content? I think you'll agree with me that there is some incredibly profound insights here. So let's unpack it. Last session, we talked about that we have to rein in this particular knowledge. And remember, particularity is one of the elements of the notion. The notion is how you grasp the true concept of something. It's scientific, it's universally scientific essence. If you don't understand what this means, it's okay. We covered it in the past, but we're going to kind of come out of the particular knowledge, which was, CRISPR as an example yesterday, but there's many particular examples, AI, self-driving cars, there's many particulars, but we want to return to this universality of the logic that underlies them, that turns them into such powerful particulars that can shape the world. And this logic is kind of what we started with in the beginning of these sessions of spirit, but we sort of started with a more abstract version of it. Now we're going to return to it again in a more concrete form. We're going to try and make this more connected and more practically usable by showing how to use it. And when we do this, this is actually, and I agree with Hegel, this is actually the greatest technology, this sort of cultural technology of the spirit of sublation. We're literally building spirit in a systematic way that doesn't kill the spirit of it, because this type of system is living. It works by this motion of growth, this motion of logical growth, that is what Hegel calls sublation. So let's get into the concreteness. Yes, we talked about this in session of the spirit SOS number 7, but we talked about it in the religious kind of sense first. So canceling sin. Hegel said that Christianity was a big part of this, but actually, if you read him, he covers all religions and that each one of them is necessary. So just because you are at the end of a system doesn't necessarily mean you're more necessary. It does mean you're more developed in a certain way, but because everything has an element of the truth in it, an element of genuine philosophy, you as a genuine ideal philosopher can pull that out and rebuild the circle of reason from any point, as long as you're not stuck in the sensuous limits of that form. They are all just moments. And if you don't grasp the momentariness of it, you're not reasoning. You're in the moment of understanding, which holds them fixed. And if your understanding isn't genuinely philosophical, you don't have freedom in your thinking. You can't get out of that moment of understanding. That is literally the limit of your understanding. Reason can sublate that. It turns the limits into fluidities, fluid, flowing, beautiful, living thought. And this is what we need to have in our room today, in our world today. So we covered it in the sensuous mode, the religious mode, and we said, okay, this is very powerful. It's as profound as religion's trying to be, and religion is profound, it's just sensuous, right? Then we tried to cover this universal logic again in SOS 10 with Hegel and Frege directly, and we kind of compared them, because Frege is in a different kind of philosophical world than Hegel. Hegel's continental philosophy, Frege's analytical, and analytical was where Frege tried to get rid of or ignore or negate all this mystical, weird stuff that these guys were doing. And says we're starting from scratch and we're just going to have clarity, because philosophy is about clear thinking, and our notations are going to get rid of this romanticism and this German idealism and all this stuff that has all this baggage with it. We just want logic. So we started purifying this universal science of logic from that sensuous religious mode. But we lost a few things along the way. We abstracted the reason. So you can see here that I have an image. And when you're trying to grasp the circularity of reason, because genuine reason isn't like in these like bite-sized bits. They are, but they're moments connected together. But you can grasp them in this sort of chopped up artificial way. And even though Frege knew that he had to build this universality, he couldn't do it. He didn't understand the circle. So it's kind of like this picture where it's a circle, but you're sort of zoomed out and the parts aren't really connecting. It's kind of like your frame is circular, but not the parts themselves. So in the image, you see a tree, but the tree is kind of linear. It's a beautiful mystical tree. I'm doing this for the artists that might come to this. But because philosophy is supposed to be artistic and beautiful and playful, right? So, but the tree itself is still branching out in an abstract way. It's not connecting itself back to itself. So picture number 2 is more like what Hegel says the science of logic and encyclopedia of the philosophical sciences, which is the logic applied in a practical way to interpret the actual world in an empirical way, because Hegel is not just one-sided in terms of empiricism versus Plato's, supersensuous or the a priori. He's doing them both because Hegel is amazing and he's a speculative thinker that can hold contradictions and unities. So this is what we're doing when we're trying to grasp the universal logic in this living kind of essence, where it's not just this abstract circle, abstract universality, but it's more like this image of this tree, this little plant here, where the roots grow into the stem, that grow into the leaves, but the leaves don't just shoot off into abstraction. The leaves actually grow back into the roots. So it's an actual circle, and it's really hard to represent that using sensuous examples like I'm doing with this plant here. The real world doesn't look like it does this, right? It's particulars, and they're like individual pieces of sense data that are doing their own thing. Whatever's connecting them is supersensuous, or it's invisible underneath. But this is what we're going to try and do today. We're going to try and build this sense of concreteness. And it is profound. And if you're stuck in sort of the ordinary understanding, what Hegel calls picture thinking, this is going to sound incredible to you and nuts and mystical. And it's the stuff that Frege and Whitehead and all the analysts of modern science want to get away from. Carnap, Popper, all them. But I think if we do this properly, it will make sense, and the profoundness won't, the science won't be lost in the profoundness. Like Hegel says, genuine philosophy is mystical, but that doesn't mean it's fantasy. So that's why we have to sublate the old version of mysticism, by not throw the baby out with the bathwater, by talking about the science of logic, this concrete logic that circles back on itself, as the pure ineffable speaking itself. It is the supersensuous behind the sensuous plant and all that stuff. But the supersensuous is pure thought, Hegel calls it. But the pure thought itself is plant-like. It is alive. So we don't normally think of our thoughts having roots and then trees, but there is an order to it. And Hegel says you start the science of logic with pure being, and it evolves itself. It literally starts growing. It grows by dialectic. And when you grasp the negative and the positive together, it's speculative. It's like growing through negating itself and then sublating itself, negating itself, sublating itself. And it kind of goes back in a circle to ground itself at the end. Now, this is something that you don't think Hegel is saying. I actually put a direct comment here for you to look at, straight from the Phenomenology of Spirit, right from the opening preface, his famous preface. He's talking about here, he's talking about using a plant example to describe this logic that is essential. And he says, real logic, concrete logic, is like the bud disappears in the bursting forth of the blossom, and one might say that the former is refuted by the latter. Similarly, when the fruit appears, the blossom is shown up in its turn as a false manifestation of the plant, and the fruit now emerges as the truth of it instead. He's saying that real refutation, as we covered in SOS number, real refutation in SOS number 9, the polemic of polemics, is how sensuous reality is developing. But you can do it in the wrong way, where you kind of interpret the stages of the plant negating themselves. So, oh, the previous stages, just get rid of it. You know, it's kind of like when you're doing the first negation, you're getting rid of your other, you're canceling it. But that's only the first moment. That's the first moment of the plant differentiating itself into its next stage. But you're not truly getting rid of that first stage. You're sublating it. You're canceling something like its immediacy, but you're not canceling the truth of that stage. You're carrying it with you. It's the same plant, right? So that's what Hegel is saying here. It sounds weird. How does a plant refute itself? He's taking a term of argumentation, right, and applying it to sensuous reality. But he's saying here that the logic underneath the plants that's driving the plants, the universals of the universe, are like this dialogue, this dialectic moving underneath the immediacy. So refutation, what he means by this word refutation here, is not abstract negation, which is what we as philosophers or abstract philosophers generally take argumentation to be. It's debate, right? You fight. But he says, no, argumentation, even as evolution in real life, is supposed to be this harmonious cooperative process where you have the moment of separation that creates tension. But if you understand the process, you turn it into this sublation. So this word refutation doesn't mean the abstract version. It means the sublative version, which is why the plant actually can grow and not kill itself. It's just going through the stages. And if you grasp each stage as a real moment in this concrete circle of life, that's when you're grasping refutation properly, the concreteness. And that's when you see the plant as in its essence, as just one plant doing its own thing. Logic is the same. There's only one logic doing its own thing. And for most of human history, they've been seeing moments of it. So that's what Leibniz, that's what Hegel, that's what Frege, that's what Noam Chomsky, they're all doing is seeing sort of moments of it. But that's making Hegel sound like the rest. Actually, Hegel did grasp the plant. He did. That's why he's using it in this quote from Phenomenology of Spirit at the beginning. So Hegel didn't just grasp one moment, he grasped all the moments together. And everybody else was trying to do that. They knew they were supposed to do that, but they were doing it in an abstract way. So that's where we're kind of going to move on and say, okay, well, now this sounds incredible, but I guess Hegel is saying that and he's pretty rigorous. But now how are these other guys doing this? Well, the reason why I picked Leibniz, Hegel, Frege, and Chomsky out of all the other philosophers is because these guys were known to explicitly be building systems. They had a system. There was a universality to what they were doing, the parts of their theories. They were stitching them together in this one totality. That's what concreteness is. When you put things into their necessary logically connected order, that makes them concrete. The parts belong to each other, not in an arbitrary or separated way. They're distinct, but they're also in a necessity. There's a rule, there's an essence that makes them do that. So Leibniz was doing it, Hegel did it, Frege was trying to do it, and Chomsky was trying. So here's a quote from Chomsky, our most modern philosopher trying to do this, or one of our most modern. So he says, language is a process of free creation. Its laws and principles are fixed, but the manner in which the principles of generation are used is free and infinitely varied. Even the interpretation and use of words involves a process of free creation. So what he's saying here in modern parlance is that there seems to be an underlying structure to reality and our language itself. But the way you put it together makes it look like it's not there because it's infinite. That's like when you grasp the plant in that abstract version of refutation, when you don't put the moments together, you see them separately. That's the particularity. And there's a whole famous movement of analytic philosophy moving away from continental metaphysics and saying, no, the whole reality is itself linguistic. It's all just language. We're not just using language. Reality itself is language talking itself. And this is a Wittgenstein in particular. And Noam Chomsky is kind of doing maybe a more subjective version. He's saying this is in our heads. He's maybe not going as metaphysical, but language has been the big focus. But he's at least admitting there seems to be something universal behind it. And this here is the science of logic. Hegel has already done it. All these guys kind of come past him, but it's because they didn't understand what Hegel did with the science of logic. That logic is what is in language, structuring it to make it understandable, to make it so that we can use it in a reasonable way and make these sort of combinations that we can communicate, because universals are what are shared. They're mutually understood. And it does seem to be innate in nature. It's not just us building it, it is innate. It's in the structure of reality itself. And there's something about human beings that is grasping that and making it explicit. So Hegel is saying something really interesting here. As I just said, Hegel's already done all this. And he agrees that he's agreeing that this linguistic kind of process is happening in the world. And it's always been happening, even before human beings came on the scene. And he explains this in his History of Philosophy. But he says something kind of strange. He says that the logic is always concrete. It's always perfect. In the supersensuous realm of the science of logic, we can kind of follow it along, and then at the end it completes itself as the absolute idea or the divine idea if you're religious. It's perfect reason in and of itself in pure thought. Then it turns itself into nature, right? So now Hegel is describing this plant-like logic evolving through history of nature. And it's the same kind of thing that's happening in our minds. And Noam Chomsky is kind of noticing it in our minds and kind of tracing back. And what he's going to do is he's going to trace it back to where Hegel starts. He's going to, if you go far enough, you go back into the circle and you end up where Hegel, I think, where Hegel starts. But Hegel says that even though there's an alignment, sometimes it doesn't look plant-like, because when you trace the science of logic in contingent history, or actual universe's history in the here and now, it doesn't look like it lines up sometimes. And that's because he says in the past, sometimes our ancient historians missed important epochs, or the notes or the documents got destroyed, or the oral traditions got destroyed. So what he is kind of saying here in this paragraph, and I want to keep it kind of rigorous because it sounds so sensational, I do want to relate it back to a respected philosopher, which is Hegel. So this is directly from his work, History of Philosophy. I picked this one because it's a passage where Hegel directly alludes to how you have to grasp the essence of the logic very concretely to be able to parse it out of history. And Noam Chomsky and Frege and the others were trying to do abstract versions of this. And he says, even if you try and do it the way he did it, which is that he just studied history, he recognized the patterns, right? Even if you try and do that, it's going to be hard. So to help you parse this paragraph, we're running a little bit out of time, but what is he saying here? He's talking about Parmenides, Heraclitus. What he's saying is, Parmenides establishes being, or the abstract universal. And he's not talking about being in general like Heidegger's Dasein. He's talking about pure being, the very first being of the science of logic, which everything begins with. That's also a universal, but it's an abstract universal. It's a universal that exists by itself. It's not all this other stuff yet. Then he talks about Heraclitus for some reason. Why is he talking about Heraclitus? And he says Heraclitus's process. And then he's talking about the next determination is being for self, and this belongs to Leucippus. Like, okay, why is he doing this? Because he's describing to you the sensuous agents that are actually explicating for the first time in human history the science of logic, the very beginning categories of the science of logic. So Parmenides was the one that grasped pure thought, or pure being. Then Heraclitus later in history came next, and he was the one that actually sublated, but he wasn't aware of it, right? This is world spirit working through him. He's the one that grasped that Parmenides and Zeno, who said that the truth can't be just pure being, there's pure nothing too. Heraclitus comes after, and he says, no, the truth is pure becoming, right? And then after Heraclitus comes Leucippus, who is uncovering this category that's very unfamiliar to even logicians today. It's called being for self. So the pure thought categories that Hegel's talking about here, that's hidden behind these sensuous agents of history, is pure being, becoming, and being for self. These are the affirmatives, but they're in their logical order, in the exact same order as chronological history. So Hegel's saying the plant-like nature of this logic is moving all with the same sort of direction. But he says here something about Parmenides. He says, Parmenides says that the nothing does not exist at all. So to help you understand why this is a significant phrase, is that this is what one-sidedness is. So remember, the session before last, we talked about what evil is in the religious sense, but in a philosophical sense, it just means ignorance. You're not grasping things concretely. You're grasping them in that first negation, held in opposites or by themselves. That's artificial. That's not plant-like. You kill the plant if you try and separate its roots from its leaves, right? So here's Hegel being critical of Parmenides, an incredibly respected philosopher of ancient Greece. Hegel gives him the credit for basically starting like formal philosophy with the first pure thought. Thales started with pure thought, but he gives Parmenides special credit here. But even Parmenides was one-sided, and this is where it's happening right here. He's saying that this is Parmenides negating the opposite of pure being, which is pure nothing. He only wants pure being to exist. That's the fixity of the understanding. It just wants something stable to hold on to. But Parmenides makes it artificial by negating the opposite, because real speculative logic means the opposites are in contradiction, but you have to think them together. They belong together. So he's criticizing Parmenides here. And then he's criticizing Heraclitus right after. This is becoming is process. It's like what Whitehead is hitting upon, but it's only transition. There is something that is stable. And being is in some way stable, but it's not this pure being of Parmenides. So what ends up happening is we end up at Leucippus. And Leucippus, his category is being for self. So what is being for self? Being for self is the sublation, the overcoming of the one-sidednesses of these two previous philosophers and a couple more, but it's supposed to be the first kind of stable category. It's where even when it negates itself, it sort of returns to itself. It is the first explication of what Hegel calls the genuine infinite and not the bad infinite. So this is like Leucippus's like, essence of his system. This is his creme de la creme. But he says something weird. He says, between all these philosophers, there's a schism in the actual contingent history. He says, thus, though the development of philosophy in history must correspond to the development of logical philosophy, there will still be passages in it which are absent in historical development. So if you didn't hear what I just said in the previous part of the paragraph, this might not make any sense to you, because you usually keep logic, the evolution of logic, separate from history's evolution. And most people don't even think that logic evolves, right? So there's a whole bunch of abstractions that you now know and can take for granted to interpret that sentence in its true kind of bizarreness. But it's actually, I think, how logic functions. So he's saying that there is a gap kind of between Parmenides and then Heraclitus, and then between them and Leucippus, history doesn't really record the development quite properly. There's categories in between them that Hegel finds that are missing, but he's able to put them back into place because he grasps the concrete nature of it. And it's kind of like the periodic table of elements. Even though when we first made that periodic table of elements, we didn't know all the elements, right? But we could predict that they must have had happened in the evolution of the universe. That's kind of what Hegel has done here. He's zoomed out and he's kind of seen the pattern, and he's kind of filling in what's missing in history. So even if he can't align a sensuous contingent philosopher with a category, he knows it must have had happened, because logic is plant life. It's not like the plant can grow its roots and then jump to the fruit. You need to have the stem and then the leaves and then the fruit comes. It's a logical progression. There's no real miracles that way. Miracles are different. Miracles happen with the cunning of reason that we talked about before, right? It's the reason that eludes the understanding, but that doesn't make it irrational. So I hope that helps you interpret a paragraph of Hegel that is usually misinterpreted and makes no sense when you're looking at it from ordinary consciousness. You have to grasp this concretion behind it. I hope I helped you. And I hope we made this academic and scholarly. We're not flying off the rails here. It does seem mystical, but it's scientifically mystical. We're sublating mysticism and religion with analytic philosophy and rigorous positive logical realism. Okay, so we've justified now. Hegel does say that this logic, this universal concrete logic, is mystical and plant-like. Not only is it, not only is evolution sort of logical, but our thoughts are logical that way and concrete, and history itself is logical and concrete that way. But it all comes down to this universal nature, and you can't really see universals with your eyes, with your hearing. You can't really sense them with your organs because they're pure thoughts. That's what makes them universal, because sensuous reality, what you see around you in terms of the notion, is the particular and the individual. And maybe even the particular is still super sensuous, but for sure it's individual. You're getting individual sense data. So you have to put those together and collate them into this pattern recognition. But the pattern recognition is just pure thought returning to itself through you. That's what spirit is. That's what religion was trying to say spirit was. But we're calling it science, just a scientific mentality. But one way to think about this is that it's all just universals. Okay, so this paragraph is kind of saying what you're really supposed to be doing. So it is the universal knowledge of universals. That's the science of logic. You are the universality, the self-reflective Russell's paradox loop, looking at itself, a universal for a universal. You are the universality, thinking the universal as the universal for a universal and as genuine reason through the universal. You think universally in the universe. So you can start to see that you can put everything in the form of each other. You can put everything in the form of universality. But every category in the science of logic, you can sort of do that with each other because it's a circle. It grounds itself. This is what the Buddhists and all the mystics are sort of doing when they're playing with language. They're recognizing that the true concreteness of the logic that is in that language. Language itself is speculative because the logic is speculative. It is literally moving contradiction. Actually, life is literally contradiction. Contradiction moves the categories out of themselves. That's what life is. It's self-determining. That's one way to think about this, and to grasp how logic grows. Okay, so you can't grasp it just in its particular. There's this universality to it. To show you what this looks like now. So now there is. You want to see the particular structure of this, like what does it actually look like? This sounds all poetic and mystical, but what does this look in practice? How are we going to use it to address CRISPR? How are we going to use it to address AI, sort of putting us in like human zoos, right? Like it's pretty intense. How are we going to use this? Well, this logic is universal. It's past, present, and future. So David in a previous session covered that, you know, the way I have this practical representation of the universality in this document called the Synchronicity Document of Philosophies, it doesn't just mean that we're going into the past and trying to restructure like Hegel did in History of Philosophy, the science of logic. We're not just going backwards. We are doing that as historians, as real philosophers were historians too, right? You are going to rebuild the logic, but Hegel already kind of did it for us up until 1800. But this document is living. That means the logic is still growing through us in this plant-like way. It's happening right now. So the document, to be truly concrete, means that it has to be upgrading itself. So we have the past that brings us to the present, but as we're doing research and development, we're going to be taking the new universals that come from the Aristotelian sort of empiricism, grasping the moment of recognition, which is the science of logic in us, recognizing the science of logic outside of us as empirical nature, and we're going to distill it in the order. We're going to take it as we discovered it in an experiment, because Hegel does endorse modern science. He just doesn't endorse the abstract, fragmented, dead life of it. That's why it's hard for the average person, especially mystics, to get into science when they're probably the best at it. If they just learn the living nature of it, then they could separate what is actual, like real science and real universals from what is their particular expressions, the poetry, right? So we're going to be updating the order. It's not just a static order that relies on the past. We are going to be upgrading it with real-time research and development. Research and development is the spiritual process of pulling the science of logic from the supersensuous into our sensuous understanding. And we want to put it in the proper order because we're making it concrete. So I'm going to open the document now that we're pretty much over time and show you what this looks like particularly, right? Here you go. This is the document we covered in the past. It has all the philosophers and philosophies in the columns. You can see we had the most ancient ones, and then it sort of gets more and more modern. And then the rows, so let's go to Hegel. So religion and philosophy started thousands of years ago, right? But let's go to Hegel. So he's the one that filled out all these columns. And this is a simplified version. This is going to get very long. It's going to be hundreds of rows once we start filling it in. But this is the logical concrete order. These are the categories, not just listed arbitrarily. They actually, Hegel says there's a development, there's one logic moving through all of them and putting them in this order. And we're going to be upgrading this order. Now, this talk was not about all the philosophers in general. We're talking about Frege, Leibniz, Chomsky. These guys had systems. They tried to do what Hegel had done. So I actually truncated these rows into another, oh, I guess I did it. Open up, there we go, sheet number 2. I sort of just took these guys and put them together so you can really see a very cogent and very powerful representation of what I'm talking about here in a practical sense. So I put the Vedas in here because Veda was like supposed to be a science, right? And if you read it very carefully, it actually does have this necessity between the sensuous categories, but they're very sensuous, hard to recognize the science of logic in it, but it's possible. But then we kind of go to Leibniz, and Leibniz was the one that started making these logical categories explicit for the first time. And then we sort of get Kant, and Kant didn't really have a total system. So I'm putting Kant here because what the science of logic is what he was calling the noumena. So if we have any Kantians here, you can see I didn't put any actual particular details in here because to Kant, there weren't any details. We couldn't know these. This is the thing in itself. But Hegel says, no, the thing in itself is what is absolutely present. And that's what these are. Our ordinary concepts of understanding, our ordinary thoughts are the most profound and eternal. They're God-like. And when you grasp them in that living plant-like logic, that's when they become divine. That's when you gain that eternal life. So here's George Boole trying to put this into more clear notation, and I'm trying to use his symbols. So you'll recognize that that addition symbol means conjugation, I think, or disjunction, the or operator, and then this is the and operator. But these aren't necessarily in the right orders. I'm just experimenting. Once we get the professionals on board, they'll be the ones that start recognizing Hegel's logic. My goal is to get Hegel's logic in the minds of these particular expressions like Boole scholars, and then they will line up the categories properly. Because each one of these categories, like this document is so incredibly powerful, unless you know how to read it by this concretion that I'm talking about, it doesn't look like anything special, but this is the sum total of all logic for like hundreds of years in an incredibly clear manner. You're literally making cross comparisons that are in separate books that have never been put together before, except for maybe by obscure PhDs that went that deep. But we got Boole, then we got Peirce. So Peirce was a semiotics, created his own shorthand, and I tried to use his symbols to repeat the same movements. You can see there's similarities, right? Because it is all the same logic. It's just different particularities. And like Chomsky said, there's an infinite amount of particularities you can do this in. Here's another version. Gottlieb Frege was doing the same thing. Here's his concept script, or me trying to do it in a spreadsheet. That U is the universal expression, and the bar is the not. That's how he represents negation and universality, which is the same as these categories here. The upside down A is the universality of Peirce. And then we get to Noam Chomsky. So the profoundness of this document is not just the vertical columns, it's also linear, like we're showing the development in time. So Chomsky kind of comes at the end and we show what's missing. He also doesn't really grasp the science of logic yet, the metaphysics of it. So what he's calling universal grammar is just the essence of universal grammar in the form of consciousness right here. This is where consciousness happens. So he's just saying this is human language, but there's underneath that, there's the metaphysical, concrete, plant-like logic. So this is how we're showing many things all at once. And the thing we're aiming for here is clarity. That's what an ideal philosopher moves in the world with, because with clarity, you know the limit and you can sublate it. And when you get really fast and good at that, reality becomes humorous. Even the worst things in the world start making sense, and you can start making them more harmonious and stopping this abstract way of thinking about reality and falling into the particular and missing the universal, missing that life. So this is how we're going to do it. I hope this makes sense. You can visit this document if you want to help fill it out. But in a practical sense, you can apply this logic to almost anything. So it's a cheat sheet for making inspirational speeches. It's a cheat sheet for writing term papers or even research papers. All we're ever doing is the same logic. And if you find somebody who writes a paper not in this logic, it doesn't read well. You know, we can kind of sense that it's hard to read, it's scattered, you know, but a really good written paper has this universal essence to it. And it's that it's following that sort of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but it's doing it in the living way that Hegel talks about it, not in this boring, dry, dead way. And I hope to give you a sort of concrete version of that. You have to see it all together at once. A lot of people say you can't understand Hegel unless you know German. So in terms of language, I sort of want to end here on this note where people are like, Mark, this is all your expression. You're nuts, man. This is just you. This is not Hegel. Yes, you gave us a couple of quotes, but like, look at this other way of interpreting it. And plus, you're not even German. And in order to grasp the real living nature of what Hegel was talking about, you have to know German. Well, actually, you don't. All you have to grasp is the universality of the logic, because it's all in that 3 moments. Logic has 3 moments, Hegel says, and you can do that in any particularity. You just have to grasp the living transitions between them, whether it's in English, German, anything. Some language are like history, they're missing grammatical structure, so you might have to invent things, right, to make the logic more speculative. But once you grasp that grammar, like I feel like I have done, once I broke through the abstractions, I can see why German is more fluid, because the way that they can put words together, they don't have this abstractness that comes with English. But once you know how to recognize that, you can start to do it with English in your own head. Neologisms are kind of like a version of what German does naturally, but they do a kind of better job with it. And that's why Hegel says German is particularly speculative, because this sort of essence to process, stability and change happens in a little bit more of a fluid way with the grammatical structure of German. But the universal logic is the same, and you can do that in any language, but the feeling does change. So I hope that helps you read Hegel and gives you confidence that you can read it in your own language, but helping to understanding the grammatical syntax of your language will help you understand the limits of your language and what you might be missing when you're reading Hegel. So I hope that makes this very practical and keeps in touch the profoundness of it. We're doing both at once. If I didn't do a good job sublating, it's my limitations. It's not necessarily Hegel. Please read him for yourself. I hope this inspires you to take him seriously, and to also look at Chomsky's work and look at Frege's work and Leibniz, and recognize what these masters were trying to do. If you want to join this movement, go to the Hegelians who want to change the world. Post your questions there. We'll try and engage with you and sublate with you. Take the wisdom quiz to kind of show how concrete, how universal is your thought, really. How many abstractions do you have inside of you? Will help sublate that. And you can challenge us and maybe point out some abstractions that we have. It's a two-way street in the world of genuine philosophy, where we're ideal philosophers that respect each other. Or you can just go straight to the synchronicity document. It's free. You can leave comments and like, oh, if we didn't do justice to your philosopher and we're not holding in the true profound concreteness of their thought, then make comments and we will have a dialogue to change it. And then if you want to start getting really practical, start doing some activism in the spirit of sublation. Remember, we're not doing the spirit of negation. You can go to the CRISPR, the Elixir of Life group. We're creating an app called WeWell, the Worldwide Essential Workers app, which we'll introduce later. But I think that is the content for today. And if you would like a little primer for next session, well, where do we go from here? How abstract are we globally? This sounds pretty fantastic, but it's not practically doable in the world. There's just too much one-sidedness, too much evil, too much ignorance, too much pandemic, too much, but I'll be talking about how we're going to take this and start building it practically, theoretically in the synchronicity document, but also in the world, in actual societies, policy, economic stuff like that. But it first starts to happen one by one through our interpersonal relationships. So I will be talking about that next time. Thank you for staying, and keep on sublating. Okay, guys, I'm just stopping the recording now, and you can stay for the discussion.